This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Andrew Shapiro with Beacon Global Strategies. Today, I'm joined by Erin Murphy, the Deputy Director for India and Emerging Asia Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Murphy has spent her career in several public and private sector roles and more than 2 decades working in the Indo-Pacific. Ms. Murphy joins us today for a discussion about undersea cables and their evolving role in U.S. national security. Stay with us as we speak with Erin Murphy. Erin, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Very excited for our conversation today to talk about undersea cables, their importance, and the threats to the global economy if undersea cables are disrupted. But first, before we get into all that, I wanted you to describe a little bit more how you got into this, what made you interested in it. Tell us a little bit more about your background. Then we can talk more about why undersea cables are important and your recent study of the threat posed by China to undersea cables.
Sure. So I'll start with a little bit of a background on my career and the long winding road and sometimes roller coaster that got me to subsea cables. So I think I kind of had one of those typical Washington career paths. I really wanted a job where I could travel, have impact. So I went overseas, first to Japan, where I discovered that the Indo-Pacific is really going to be like the most important region, I think, for my career, for the future of when I'd be in a sort of career, whether it's government or the private sector. I taught English there, came back, went to grad school as one does, gathered as much debt as possible so that I'd have to work for the rest of my life. And then I joined the Central Intelligence Agency as a political analyst. And it was really there where you start understanding global threats and how they affect the day-to-day. So you're in the background and, you kind of understand how things work, but you have to think of kind of the bigger picture, maybe what companies don't think about, maybe what, your average citizen doesn't think about, and how can you prepare policymakers to make the right decisions to try to protect infrastructure, people's safety, our policy, and the United States still maintaining its economic and political strength. So from there, that's when I really started working on Burma issues in Southeast Asia. Like you, eventually I left government and started my own company, really investing in responsible investments in the region, especially in emerging economies in Southeast Asia, and kind of learning what does it take for a country to start rebuilding and build to be prepared for the future. And really one of the biggest parts of that was digital infrastructure. And in that role, really kind of seeing where the competition was with China. See Huawei and ZTE come in with mobile devices, software, hardware, and really kind of understanding where they were basically ousting U.S. partners and allies out of the markets that are pretty strategic for the United States. So from there, I went to the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is a relatively new U.S. agency, and continued to work on infrastructure and major investments in the Indo-Pacific, and eventually joined CSIS. And Dan Rundy, who was previously at CSIS with a project on prosperity and development, he gets these spidey senses and was like, Erin, I think subsea cables are going to be is the hottest thing. I was like, okay, that's weird, but sure. And we did a paper last year, and it really is just exploded in terms of importance. You're seeing more stories about potential intentional cuts. And I think everyone's starting to realize where their internet comes from. And this gets to your question of what is the importance of subsea cables. I think we think of the internet as being all around us. And we're able to send emails, we can check our, bank balance, we can check on social media, but it's so much more than that. And it is all mostly powered by subsea cables. It's one of the oldest technologies. The first subsea cable was laid in 1850, but it's also like one of the most futuristic technologies because as it's developed, now it's fiber optic driven and can push terabits of information per second through a fiber optic cable, which is just, incredible to think of. But it is basically the backbone of the internet. Anything that you do online, even us recording this podcast, probably happens over a subsea cable.
So when you say that anything online involves subsea cables, if there was a disruption to subsea cables if during a conflict they were disrupted. Is there a plan B?
There is a plan B, and we've had some examples of that, not necessarily in conflict, but there's been several natural disasters where you've seen multiple cable cuts. Now, if there's damage, if there's an accident, if there's a natural disaster, this happens all the time. Commercial vessels, fishing vessels, they drop anchor accidentally and sometimes drag it over the cable and it damages it. But what operators can do is reroute the internet traffic while they repair the cable, which can take weeks or months. But when you sever multiple cables, that's really problematic. And we've seen that happen a couple of times. One with the Tohoku earthquake in 2011 with Japan. It slowed down internet traffic between the US and Asia. So it didn't just impact Japan. There was the Tongan earthquake in 2022, which effectively cut off Tonga from the rest of the world in terms of internet connectivity. I mean, Tonga is just a small island, but it really damaged the connectivity for other Pacific islands. But we've also seen where there's been cable damage in the Red Sea off the coast of Egypt that slowed down traffic, not just for Northern Africa, but for Asia and Europe. So when you damage these cables and you can't reroute traffic to other fiber optics, it can really slow down the operations that you can do. Like opening up a PDF is going to take forever. Trying to push through billions of dollars of transactions are going to be incredibly slow. And if you're trying to pull up a healthcare file or information about a patient, and not just one, it's going to take forever.
Who owns these cables and who's responsible for making sure they work?
For the most part, the cables that we use are all privately owned. So every decision that they make in terms of laying a cable, building these cables are really commercially driven. So you have four major cable manufacturers. One is from the US, Subcom. There's Alcatel from France. There's NTT and NEC NEC from Japan. And then there's Huawei Marine Technology, or HMN Tech, that are building the cables. But most of them are owned and operated by consortia or hyperscalers. So Google, Meta, AWS, and Microsoft are big time players in these cable projects. And you can look on telegeography, which monitors all of these subsea cables, and look to see who's part of the consortium. And you'll see like SoftBank or NTT, Vodafone, other telecom companies. But that's really changed a lot in the last 20 years. Prior, it used to just be telecom companies that really drove the decisions for laying cables and where they would go. But now it's really the hyperscalers that are using these cables for themselves, but also selling off bandwidth to others.
So you earlier this year, you worked on a report on China's approach to undersea cables and the potential threats that the PRC poses to undersea cables for the United States and others. Can you go into a little bit more depth about what you found in this study?
Yeah, so China is a growing market in the cable technology. If you've followed China and its Belt and Road Initiative, there's also a digital counterpart called the Digital Silk Road, which doesn't get as much attention now, but it was kind of where China was getting more competitive. And what I was talking about earlier and what I was seeing in Southeast Asia, where you had Huawei and CTE technology, hardware, software, you saw it mostly in terms of like mobile handsets. But for the subsea cable, there's a growing recognition of how important this is to economic development and your role in the international community because of the financial transactions that go through it, the communication and whatnot. So Huawei has been growing its market share in terms of laying cables. They only have about 10% of that now. But what is also important to know is that China has a lot of repair ships. So cable laying ships and cable repair ships are almost one and the same. They have all the same equipment because if you're repairing a cable, you have to kind of pull it up, cut it, add the new cable. For laying cables, you probably have all this material on the ship anyway, but they're starting to repair cables as well. And they're the largest ship manufacturer in the world. Second is Korea, then Japan, then the US, but it's like a huge gap. And then, of course, you have a smattering of others like the Greeks and others. But China is really controlling sort of the repair ship capability. And so that poses some questions as to what are they doing to the cables. Now, to tap or conduct espionage on cables is really challenging. as I mentioned before, there are terabits of information, and it's all encrypted that are going through these fiber optics. So at least at this stage, it's really hard for them to kind of tap a cable that they're repairing without the operator knowing what's happening. But if it's one of theirs, well, we don't know. But there is growing concern about, what they're doing. And they just announced, and this was in a paper that we released a couple of months ago, that they had just kind of put out and I don't even know what it's called. If it was just kind of like a bid, or we're just building this ship that has a capability of dropping a cable to 4,000 meters. So I don't know if they're laying cables in the Mariana Trench, but that means they also have the capabilities of cutting cables to that depth. So, you could look at it that, we're overreacting because every cable repair ship or cable laying ship has cutting capabilities to be able to repair. But why did they advertise this? So I think that really spun up a lot of security experts around this. And, I'm in Washington. I love to get spun up. So I wrote about it.
Given the importance of cables to the global economy, what did your study find was the most significant vulnerability or threat that are posed to the security and continued use of cables?
Yeah, so shameless plug, we're also coming out with a bigger report about subsea cables, everything you wanted to know and didn't, but you will, and that will be released sometime in September. Our publication staff willing, they're very stretched thin at this point. But, I would just kind of highlight at the beginning that the biggest threat to subsea cables in terms of damage was really, kind of natural disasters and accidents. So, commercial ships kind of drop anchor. The environment that they're in, it can be rocky. It's in tough terrain. And these cables have, a lifespan, and they do the best they can when they're putting it in salt water and rocky water. But it has about a 25-year lifespan without damage from accidents or intentional cuts. But in terms of, the security threats that I think keeps Washington policymakers up at night and globally is just the lack of redundancy of the cables, that if they do get cut intentionally, how are we going to be able to fix this, especially in an active conflict situation? You're already getting a hint of that in the Red Sea, where the Houthis are active, there are Djibouti pirates that are active. And so if damage happens to a cable or it needs to be replaced, companies can't get ships insured to go out there because, who are you going to convince to go out there to be like, hey, you might get shot at or bombed, but have we got an exciting project for you? I mean, not everybody wants to do that. And the folks that do, you might want to question. So there's a bit of that. But when it comes to the redundancy, then what becomes a problem is permitting regulation, like the most boringest 101 sort of thing. And so this is really where the gap between private sector and public sector starts coming together. Whereas, the public sector is like, oh my God, what if these Russian ghost fleets cut all these cables, or the Chinese in the South China Sea or elsewhere start cutting cables? And, especially in the case of China, they pretty much claim, exclusive economic zones and territorial waters, all over the place. I'm surprised they haven't found a piece of pottery and said, oh, look, the North Atlantic is also our territory. So it really gets difficult for companies to get the permits to then repair. But that becomes a problem in the United States too. So you have private sector companies saying, we need better permits and regulations. And you have US government saying, but the Russians and the Chinese. And it's like, there's a big gap there, but it's all to the same issue. So it really comes down to redundancy and the most exciting, sexy thing of permitting.
So as you went into this study and your research, did anything surprise you that you didn't know going in? Were there any unexpected patterns or risks that emerged that surprised you as you undertook your research?
There were some. The first thing that really surprised me was really how important subsea cables are to us.
Mm-hmm.
I, like everyone else, was like, the internet is all around us. It's in a cloud. You understand, I think, like what we in the biz call terrestrial cables, which, are buried underground and go crisscross around the country. But really understanding the importance of like this very old technology that is also just, is going to be part of us all. And then I think the next question that comes out about it is like, okay, well, what about satellites? Isn't that important? And yeah, but if you have one satellite, or, you have something like Starlink, which I think is starting to get to this issue. If a cable goes down, you use satellite more as backup. And that backup cannot handle the amount of users that are going to be, rerouted to that satellite to get that capability. So satellite technology just hasn't gotten to that point that it could ever come close to what a subsea cable can do. So this is our technology until they discover something better, which, like, honestly, why reinvent the wheel when this seems to be working? I think some of the other interesting items that came out about this was, how difficult this industry is. That you would think, oh, just lay a cable, but really the permitting and regulatory issues are incredibly challenging. You have marine sanctuaries. You have fishery unions, which are incredibly tough to deal with. They're a hardy folk. We found this in our case studies, especially in Japan and Ireland, where the Irish, and it's really up to the company to deal with them. The government isn't involved at all. So, they're the ones doing all the negotiations, including with local and state and tribal governments, as well as international governments, making sure they're following the law. The last two things I would say that surprised me are the laws that govern this. We have an 1884 law that is primarily governing when an accident or an intentional cut happens, who is responsible. And really, there's only a couple dozen countries that are signed on to that, which includes the United States and Russia, but not China. So, how do you enforce these laws? There's also UNCLOS, the law of the sea, that we're not a part of, and partly because that was over in the 1980s, deep sea mining rights and, questions of sovereignty. I think the last thing that also keeps me up at night, which are many, many things, are the security of landing sites. So if you have a cable, you have to have a landing site. And they're all over the place. If you know it, you'll know what it is, but most people don't. And there's just not enough security. So when you're talking about cyber attacks, espionage, tapping, that's where they are the most vulnerable. No one's not going to go paddling out to the sea and be like, I'm going to tap this cable. I'm going to get so much information. No. But at cable landing sites, if you know what you're looking for, you can do a lot of damage really quickly. I kind of hesitate to bring this up because I'm like, oh, now I'm going to inspire someone to go and attack a cable landing site. But it's really concerning. And not every country there's no broad guidelines as to how to protect a cable landing site. And every country kind of takes their responsibility a bit differently. They're either too trusting or they're like, who even knows what a cable landing site is? I mean, you can figure it out.
Yeah. Your report focused on China, but you made reference earlier to Russia has been part of the conversation, and there's been reports of Russians arrested for disrupting cables and, in Scandinavian waters. Can you discuss to the extent to which great power competition with China and Russia is shaping the current undersea cable environment?
Yeah, it really is. And it's less in the background now and definitely more in the forefront, where you have NATO very concerned about what's happening. Because if you it's kind of an Occam's razor. It's like after the start of the Ukraine war, all of a sudden, all these cables kept getting cut, whether they're energy cables, of which there's no redundancy, and subsea cables. And this is what is really, annoying, frustrating, scary about what we would call gray zone tactics, is that you're not really sure if it was intentional. Was it unintentional? Was it an accident? It's hard to tell. And because the ocean is vast, to find out what ship did it, you really have to use good old sleuthing. They don't necessarily have to, and they don't register, oh, we're going to be here, we're going to be there. They can turn off their satellites so you can't find their location. So they can kind of cover their tracks, and it's almost like super old fashioned espionage, or sabotage, where they go out and they're like, oops, we got this cable. Sometimes the way that you can tell is if, you just so happen to be surveilling and they do have their satellite technology on so you can track them, they start going in a zigzag pattern. And that's so that they have the best chance of cutting the cable, because an anchor on the ground will bounce. So if you kind of keep going back and forth, again, I don't want to give anyone a handbook as to how to cut a cable, but like, I don't know how many people own big ships and are like feeling sabotagey today, but yeah, Russia has all these, they're one of the most unfriendly, very hostile actor and can do it in ways that are like, we don't care. So they have these ghost fleets that are really able to move oil and gas assets to avoid sanctions, but then they can also do, some fun cable cutting along the way. What does Russia care? Because they're not really this is not an important technology for them. They have mostly fiber optic cables going over the ground. So this is not as big a deal for them. And so that kind of makes things, they're so easy to deal with. Andrew, I know that you've had a lot of really great experiences with them, but yeah, it's really challenging.
We're going to take a quick break and we will be right back with more of our discussion with Erin Murphy.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
I wanted to turn now to the vulnerability of the United States to potential vulnerabilities of the undersea cable system. Mm-hmm. How exposed would you say are U.S. civilian and military communications infrastructure to cable disruption in a high-end conflict scenario with China?
Pretty vulnerable. We have a lot of cables going off the West Coast that go through China, that go to Southeast Asia, that kind of traverse into the South China Sea. And so our internet is connected to that. It's a globally connected infrastructure. You can't isolate yourself from that because if you're trying to move transactions or do cross-border commerce, this is not something that you can make yourself a subsea cable autarky. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. And, it comes down to a question is how do you monitor and protect these cables? I already mentioned redundancy. That's one way to do it. And there's kind of two schools of thoughts about that. Do you have one cable alleyway, or maybe alleyway is not the right word, where only cables go so ships can't go across it? They're better easy to monitor, but it doesn't take much to be I'm just going to plow right through these and cut all of the cables. So they are much more vulnerable. And then the other thing is on redundancy, just lay cables wherever you can. And so if one goes down, you can start rerouting traffic. But the monitoring side is incredibly challenging because, as I mentioned, the ocean is vast. Most ships don't necessarily register themselves, especially if they're up to no good. So how do you know how to monitor these? What sort of assets do you use? Do you use air and naval assets to try to track these ships? It's incredibly difficult. So it really also comes down to the countries themselves where the cables land to be able to participate in what these activities are. But we are pretty vulnerable.
To what degree do the private sector cable owners understand and address the national security implications of their infrastructure?
I think they understand it, but for them, they're going to look at the commercial case and what the cost and risk analysis of where they need to put their efforts. For them, the major issue is permitting and regulation. So if you come to them and say, hey, we're concerned about national security, how do we build a more resilient network? They'd say redundancy. But we can't have redundancy if we have to go through state, local, tribal, federal laws, and then international laws to lay these cables. And then overseas, it also becomes increasingly challenging. So I think there's an understanding, but I think, they'd push back and saying, well, if you want these cables laid as quickly as possible, we really need to get to this regulatory issue. And so where it used to take a long time to manufacture cables, now they can manufacture cables really quickly. It comes down to the permitting side. So again, I think there's an understanding, but even during our report and the research for the bigger report we're releasing in September, whenever we brought up sabotage or anything like that, they're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And I'm like, I don't know. And, trying to explain where government was coming from. And, I think trying to bridge that gap is a real challenge.
You've laid out how important undersea cables are to everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
What is your sense? Does the U.S. military have a backup plan if during deterrence fails and during a conflict undersea cables were cut? How would it impact our readiness to address? Would it be just reliance on satellites? Have they thought through other means if the undersea cables became a target during a conflict?
So they haven't shared all their plans with me for, I guess, good reason. Some things we have to keep secret, but it is certainly top of mind. And I think we've seen that in terms of congressional legislation. There's efforts to put building out the subsea cable network and making it more resilient, but also trying to figure out what's the best way to protect the network. So, Congress is involved. And then in terms of the military, Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, just how do we protect this? Because it's not just overseas, like saying Guam, or for assets in Hawaii that are also vulnerable to cuts, because they're relying on these networks as well. And of course, their own cables. Yeah, I think there are probably plans, but I think for the most part is trying to figure out what is the best way to start protecting these cables, especially as they become so important to our day-to-day life. Is it adding sensors to cables? It's expensive. But if you put a sensor on a cable, it's able to kind of take a picture of what's going on around it and who caused the damage, what caused the damage. So there's certainly thoughts in place.
You talked about how the undersea cable system is privately owned. Mm-hmm. Given the importance to our economy, to our national security, what should be done to bridge the gap between commercial interests and national security?
Well, I think the first one, I'd say, this is important in every aspect of life, is communication. And I think as we're starting to see more of an overlap between public and private sector interests, in that the private sector is really kind of the foundation of a lot of the things that we do now, especially when it comes to tech. There needs to be more communication with the public sector and vice versa, and trying to get on side, not talk to each other, but what is it that the private sector needs to be successful, but also calm the fears that the private or the public sector has about infrastructure. Some of this has to go around laws. Some of this has to go around financing and funding. But there really needs to be a lot more communication between the two, because you can't force the private sector to do something. I suppose you could in some countries, but so far we're not doing that. I mean, you could have patriotic capital, but these are primarily commercial decisions. But, I think the private sector, if they're to understand why government is concerned, there needs to be more conversations where folks don't talk at each other.
In the U.S., which government agencies, executive branch stakeholders, and committees and members on the Hill are most actively engaged in undersea cable issues right now?
There are so many government agencies, and that's also part of the problem, because who's in charge? The Department of Homeland Security has a big piece of this, especially when it comes to the security of it. And that's really through CSIS. That also helps come up with the rules. The FCC is also a major player in subsea cables. They're the ones that are doing the permitting and the regulations. DoD issues permits as well. They have offices within the DoD. National Security Council, of course, makes some decisions that go through it. NOAA, if it still exists under the Department of Commerce, that's the thing. It's like I could list all of these, but are they still here? We're not sure. Yeah. They help regulate the impact of cables on marine life and ecosystems. So they're the ones that are looking at the marine sanctuaries and the environmental damage on that. You have the Environmental Protection Agency, if they're still around, that does things. But you also have intelligence agencies, the Navy, the Coast Guard. They're also involved, whether it's in policy, but also in terms of permitting and regulations. And you also have state, local, and tribal that you have to deal with as well. In terms of Congress, I think as we've seen with many other policies and issues, there's always certain members that have a bee in their bonnet about, subsea cable. Suddenly they're like, oh my gosh, this is super important. And I think it's especially those states that have a lot of cable landing stations. Economically, it certainly contributes to their local economy. And that's really the West Coast states and Florida. but also Hawaii. And then in terms of committees, I think the ones that you would typically believe would be involved, like HVAC, SFRC, and for folks who need an acronym, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee, but also some of the ones that that oversee Interior and Commerce, that are interested in also the ones that are looking at tech companies. Members in committees that look at that would be interested too. So it's really like a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
You described, the importance of communication.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any successful communication going on with the private sector through any of these agencies, any structures that have been set up to facilitate this conversation, or is it more ad hoc, case-by-case basis?
Well, CSIS may not be a government agency, but we had a roundtable about a year and a half ago where Dan was having his spidey senses, and we're like, we'll see if anybody's interested. And more than 80 people showed up for, a not hastily organized, but like pretty quickly organized roundtable discussion online. And we had all the hyperscalers, we had almost every government agency represented. But from that, we heard from DHS that, this really got them to thinking, because it was probably not the first time, but I think so starkly to hear where the private sector was. So there are efforts with DHS, but, I think it's still a little bit ad hoc. There was something called Team Telecom that was supposed to be kind of an interagency group that would work with the private sector and whatnot. I've heard mixed reviews, and certainly this year with, everyone getting fired or government agencies falling apart, it's really kind of hard to know who's where and what's happening. I've even heard that CISA might get cut, and talking to some congressional friends, we're like, what? So I think that there's a concern there. But I think, this gets to one of the other challenges is who's in charge on this, like who's really going to lead. And you can allocate jobs to whatever agency, but there really needs to be a point person in government to do this.
We talked earlier about some of the recent high-profile incidents in Scandinavia involving cable sabotage and the resulting investigations. Are there any lessons that the U.S. can learn from those investigations?
Well, that they can happen, and it can happen closer to than we think. I think this has really woken up NATO, and that should wake us up too, because there's a question over, and this is where we get into these gray zone tactics. If you deliberately cut cables, is this an act of war? And so I think that really needs to kind of hit home. Where do we put infrastructure damage intentionally in terms of what we see as an attack? I think what this also did was kind of signal to folks that we really need to update international maritime law and probably local law as well. I mean, the Finns were rereading the 1884 law and saying, can we board the ship? I'm not really sure. Are they signatory? What can we do? And I think what that really flags is that we need to probably update it. There's organizations that look at this. There are people who sign on to it, but it's mostly voluntary. So it's going to take leadership and also to recognize what this infrastructure means to us.
So you anticipated the next topic I wanted to go into, which was about international efforts and this multilateral dynamics. You've mentioned a couple of times the 1884 Cable Convention, which was probably during the time of the telegraph.
Yeah.
was when it was signed. What would it take to update something like that? And is it possible in the current geopolitical environment to make these types of changes in international law? Is there a common interest among nations that could incentivize, updating international law, which, as you stated, you think would be helpful?
Well, I guess nothing is impossible, but it sure as heck feels like it now. Because what you would need is leadership and also belief in multilateral systems, which if you're looking to the U.S. for leadership now, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I often question, are we still going to be part of the UN? I mean, in my most spiraling, days, I'm like, oh God, we're going to withdraw from everything. But you do need to be part of a multilateral system to have rules in place. So there is a push on UNCLOS, which does update regularly for technology and whatnot, and changes in territorial waters, changes in whatnot, that the U.S. is still not a part of. And there's an argument that could we be more effective if we were? China is part of UNCLOS. And, the other argument is, well, China's going to do whatever they want, whether or not we are part of UNCLOS. Well, maybe we'll see what happens if we are part of UNCLOS. And we can certainly support our allies that use UNCLOS regularly over territorial claims in South China Sea, and that includes the Philippines. So there are regional groupings, I think, that kind of deal with its own issues. So the Baltic Sea, you're really going to have more of a Russia issue. But then there was a question mark of whether or not the Chinese were involved because it was a Chinese flag ship or there were Chinese crew. And so there are a lot of concerns about that. We haven't seen ghost ships in, South China Sea or in Asia. But then if you go to Egypt, you have more concerns over like the Houthis and the pirates. So there are certainly more specific issues that are regional, where you could have regional groups deal with that, whether it's NATO or you have African Union or whatnot. And but it's really going to take updating. I don't know if that is even possible, as you say, in this sort of environment. You look at groups that were created, like the UN Security Council, with great fanfare and hopes for the future, and look how it's turned out. You had the G7, which I think had a lot of opportunities, and certainly this has been highlighted in their communiques. But it's really dependent on who the chair is. You look at the G20, and we're not even going. So it's unclear. The U.S. is certainly part and parcel of this, and it's primarily because it is our hyperscalers that are laying the cables, and we have so many landing stations here. So that, I think, also falls onto the private sector to also push for this. I think that matters to this administration. So if they're saying, hey, we need this, that argument might hit better with this administration than, say, coming from policy wonks and Washington types.
Let's talk a little bit about, the policy considerations that U.S. government should be considering. How active should be the U.S. government be in play? What role should it play in fostering resilience? Now, these hyperscalers, they have every interest in the world in protecting their cables.
Yes.
So should we leave it to them because it's in their economic interest, or should the U.S. government be given the importance to both our economy and our national security, be playing a bigger role in, public sector investment and regulation, or even in using our alliances to protect cables?
Yeah, I think those things that you mentioned are exactly what the U.S. should be doing. I mean, there's a fine balance in, making sure that there isn't too much oversight from the U.S. government. But, I'm more of the belief that the U.S. government is there to help, and it should, and people should turn to the U.S. government for that type of help. Part of it on the international side in terms of redundancy, resiliency, and protecting the infrastructure is working with our allies. Just in the Indo-Pacific, we have Australia, we have the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and Thailand. And they're all pretty critical when it comes to these types of this infrastructure, whether they have landing stations or they're in their or pass through their territorial waters. So, one idea that has been out there that Singapore deploys quite regularly are areas on trying to assign the blame and making sure that they're responsible. So passing laws where the ship is responsible, or whoever owns a ship is responsible for the cable repair, but also the country under which it is flagged. I think this gets to other issues as well. There's only a handful of countries that usually kind of sell their flags for ships to use, which can be a little concerning for national security. But like Panama, Belize, Bahamas, I don't think they're too excited about, being held responsible for a ship that either intentionally or accidentally cuts. But this is one way to push to try to limit cuts and start moving on responsibility. The U.S. government can also help in terms of financing, where helpful. Maybe that's on sensor technology in areas that are regularly under attack or could be areas of attack. But I think a lot of it also comes down to that communication with the private sector. Permitting regulatory issues will continually be top of mind for the private sector. So if you do want the resiliency, hey, we need this to move faster, but we also need the U.S. government to press other countries in moving faster on permitting. China is really the big problem here. But there's also other cabotage laws, which are laws that govern what happen in territorial waters, and which we have too in the Jones Act. which requires ships to use that country's sailors and ships, which we don't really have right now. So there are things that the U.S. government should do, but it should be more like we're ready to help the private sector. You do your thing, but we have real concerns. And so we need to be prepared if this happens.
You mentioned you've got an upcoming report based on field work that you've done. What emerging risks or innovative solutions would you highlight for policymakers and industry on a going forward basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think the emerging risks are the risk, and it's low, but seeing where we are geopolitically, are intentional cuts to cables. I would also add climate change to that. As the oceans get a lot rougher, it's going to be harder for ships to go out and repair the cables, but also leave these cables a little bit more vulnerable. There's some things that we can't prevent, like volcanoes or like underwater landslides and whatnot. But I think we need to be more prepared as to how do we classify an intentional cut on a cable, especially as it affects our day-to-day life. In terms of technology and going forward, one, in terms of how to protect cables, the sensor technology, it will also have other benefits as well in terms of understanding, the marine atmosphere around that cable. It's not just to identify ships and start, figuring out who's kind of dilly-dallying overhead, but also to get a better sense of what's happening underwater. A place we don't know much about, but it would certainly help us have a better understanding of the ocean.
Well, Erin, this has been a really fascinating discussion on an issue that's incredibly important, and it feels like people should be talking about it a bit more. And I think your reports are helping to bring it more to the center of the conversation. So very much appreciate you sharing your insight with us, and we'll look forward to the upcoming study in the fall.
Thanks, Andrew. And I hope after this, everyone says cables are my passion.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Erin Murphy. I'm Andrew Shapiro. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.